The sun dipped below the jagged skyline, casting long shadows over the ruined city once called Brookmere. Once filled with life, laughter, and the hum of busy streets, it now stood in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional distant snarl or the flapping of crows circling above. From the rooftop of an abandoned hotel, Mason Quinn crouched low, his heart thudding in his chest. He adjusted the cracked scope on his rifle and scanned the streets below. The streets were crawling with them, the dead. Not the slow, mindless creatures the old movies promised, but fast, cunning hunters, mutated by whatever nightmare had torn through America months ago. Mason wasn't alone. Beside him, Leah Tran, a sharp-eyed scout with braided black hair, pressed her back against the rooftop wall, checking the battery on her shortwave radio. Below them, in the alley, Tarek, a former mechanic-turned-fighter, waited with a small group, ready to make a dash across the open street to the next building. "See anything?" Leah whispered. "Yeah," Mason muttered, squinting through the scope. "Too much." The dead moved strangely tonight. They weren't just wandering, they were grouping. Climbing onto cars, sniffing the air, clustering in small packs near the alleys. Mason's gut twisted. Something was off. The mission was simple: cross the district to the old pharmacy, where supplies were rumored to be stashed. But simple never meant easy. The rooftops were the only relatively safe path, streets were death traps, alleys worse. One wrong move and the dead would swarm, turning escape into a deadly gamble. Suddenly, Mason's earpiece crackled. "This is Tarek. We're in position." "Your call, boss." Mason exhaled slowly. "All right. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Tarek and his team darted from the shadows, sprinting across the street. Leah leaned over the edge, her crossbow ready, eyes tracking their every step. Mason's fingers tightened on the rifle as a low growl echoed from the alleyway. "Left. They're coming from the left." Mason hissed. From the darkness, a pack of dead burst forth, faster than they should have been. Tarek's team barely had time to react. Leah's bolt zipped down, striking one in the neck. Mason fired, his shot cracking through the night, dropping another, but there were too many. "Back! Back!" Mason barked into the radio. The team scrambled, 2 fighters slipping behind overturned dumpsters. But Tarek was trapped. One of the dead lunged, tackling him to the ground. Mason's scope jerked as he tried to line up a shot, heart hammering. A rooftop door banged open behind Mason. Sophie, their medic, appeared, gasping. "They're on the next roof. We have to move." Mason spun around. "What do you mean they're on the roof?" "They can't." A shriek cut through the night. From across the gap between buildings, one of the dead, leaner, longer-limbed, almost spidery, scrambled over the edge, eyes glinting in the moonlight. Mason didn't wait. "Go! Go!" The team rushed across the rooftop, dodging crumbling concrete and rusted metal. Mason fired at the spidery dead, knocking it back, but more were following, leaping the gaps between rooftops like monstrous predators. Leah hauled open the rooftop door, shoving Sophie inside. Mason covered their retreat, firing as the creatures closed in. One slipped, tumbling between the buildings, but 2 more were already climbing up. Inside, they bolted the door and scrambled down the stairwell, boots thudding on dusty steps. "Where's Tarek?" Sophie gasped, clutching her medkit. Mason's face was grim. "He didn't make it." Leah slammed a fist against the wall, biting back a curse. But they couldn't mourn now. Mason knew it, they all did. In this war zone, hesitation was death. The stairwell echoed with the distant sounds of scratching, tapping. They were already trying to find another way in. "We need to move," Mason said. "We cut through the building, reach the next block. Maybe we can still hit the pharmacy before dawn." Leah shot him a sharp look. "Or maybe we're walking into a trap." He couldn't argue. Every street, every alley, every rooftop was now a battleground, and the dead were getting smarter, faster. But supplies were running low, and the safe house wouldn't hold out forever. They had to keep pushing. They burst out into the hotel's ground floor, the smell of mold and decay heavy in the air. Shattered glass crunched underfoot. Outside the boarded windows, Mason saw shadows flicker, figures moving, circling, hunting. "We stick to the shadows," he whispered. "Stay low, stay quiet." They crept through the wreckage, adrenaline sharp in their veins. The city loomed outside, dark and hungry. Somewhere ahead was the pharmacy, and with it, the supplies they desperately needed. But Mason's mind raced. Why were the dead grouping tonight? Why were they climbing rooftops? This wasn't random, something was driving them, something more organized, more dangerous. He tightened his grip on the rifle. Whatever waited in the alleys ahead, he'd be ready. Because in Dead America, survival wasn't just about fighting monsters. It was about outsmarting them. And tonight, the war had only just begun. End of Part 1. Let me know when you want Part 2. The cold night air wrapped around Mason like a cloak as he led the team through the darkened hotel lobby. Cracked chandeliers dangled above, swaying faintly as if the building itself was holding its breath. Mason paused, raising a clenched fist, signaling Leah and Sophie to stop. Somewhere outside, the dead prowled. Mason's heart pounded in his ears. Every shadow could hide one of those spidery mutants they'd seen on the rooftops, and worse, they now knew the dead could coordinate. That was the part gnawing at his thoughts the most. "We can't stay here long," Leah whispered, eyes darting to the boarded windows. Mason gave a single nod. "We move through the service hallway. It should connect to the back alley." Sophie, clutching her med kit, hesitated. "And if the alley's packed?" Mason offered a grim smile. "Then we find another rooftop." Carefully, they pushed through the cracked door behind the front desk, entering a narrow corridor lined with rusting metal shelves and overturned carts. Dust floated in the beams of their flashlights, and every creak of the old building made Sophie flinch. Suddenly, Leah held up her hand. "Wait. Listen." Mason froze. Somewhere ahead, past the kitchen doors, came the faintest shuffle, slow, dragging steps, the kind only the dead made when they weren't hunting. But Mason had learned the hard way, even slow dead could be a trap. He motioned Leah forward. She crouched by the door, peeking through a cracked window. 4 of them. Just milling around. Mason exhaled. "We take them quiet." Leah drew her crossbow, Mason readied his knife. Sophie stayed back, her breath shallow. With careful steps, they pushed through the door. The kitchen was a wreck, tables overturned, pots scattered, mold creeping up the walls. The 4 dead were near the far exit, swaying slightly, the soft sound of their ragged breathing filling the room. Mason crept up behind the first one, driving his knife into its temple. Leah's bolt thudded into another's skull. The third spun around, mouth opening in a snarl, but Mason was already there, silencing it. The 4th. A crash echoed outside. The dead jolted, its head snapping toward the sound. But it wasn't alone, shadows surged at the kitchen window, bony fingers slamming against the glass. "They heard us," Mason growled. "Back! Go back!" Leah shouted. But it was too late. The kitchen door exploded inward as a new wave of dead burst through, not the slow ones, but the hunters. Their long limbs scraped across the walls as they lunged forward, shrieking. Mason shoved Sophie behind him, firing 2 shots before yanking Leah back through the service hallway. The team sprinted through the narrow corridor, dodging falling shelves as the dead slammed through behind them. "There!" Sophie pointed, spotting an emergency exit. They burst outside into the night, only to freeze. The alley wasn't empty. Rows of dead filled the narrow space, some climbing on crates, others clawing at dumpsters, all turning their heads in unison toward the fresh sound of survivors. Their eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, and a chilling realization sank into Mason's chest. They had been waiting. "Rooftop!" Mason barked. Leah spotted a metal ladder on the side of the building. Mason covered her as she scrambled up first, pulling Sophie after her. Mason fired into the crowd, trying to slow the advancing dead as they surged forward. Hands grabbed at his legs, Mason kicked hard, yanking himself up the ladder just as the dead slammed against the base. Leah helped haul him over the rooftop edge, and they all collapsed in a gasping heap. For a brief second, silence hung in the air, then the scratching began. The dead were climbing. Mason forced himself to his feet, adrenaline roaring through him. He scanned the rooftops ahead. We need a path. Find the next building. Leah was already moving, scanning the rooftop gap. Jumpable. Barely. They raced to the edge as the first dead crawled over the rooftop, their elongated limbs pulling them up with unnatural speed. Mason fired once, twice, dropping the leaders, but more followed. Go, he shouted. Leah leapt first, landing hard on the next rooftop. Sophie followed, Mason right behind, his boots slipping on the crumbling ledge before he scrambled over. The three of them collapsed, breathless, on the new rooftop. Below, the streets churned with movement. Mason's stomach turned, more dead were pouring into the alleys, surrounding the area like a tightening noose. They're pushing us, Leah gasped. Hurting us. Mason's jaw clenched. Yeah. And we're walking right where they want. Suddenly, a soft voice crackled over the radio, a voice they hadn't heard in days. This is Tarek, anyone. If you're alive, don't go to the pharmacy. It's a trap. They're waiting. Mason's blood ran cold. He exchanged a sharp look with Leah. They weren't just fighting a mindless enemy. They were fighting something that planned. And the real war was only just beginning. End of part 2. Ready for part 3. Mason gripped the radio so tightly his knuckles whitened. Tarek's faint, crackling voice was both a blessing and a curse. They hadn't heard from him in days, they'd assumed he was dead. But now? His warning came too late. Leah crouched beside Mason, her face pale under the moonlight. He said the pharmacy's a trap. But we weren't even headed there. Sophie looked from one to the other, eyes wide. If they're setting traps, that means they know where everyone is. Mason's mind raced. The dead had been growing smarter, more coordinated. But this? Laying traps? Sending waves to herd survivors like prey? This was something new, something terrifying. We need to find Tarek, Mason said firmly. If he's alive, he knows something. Something we don't. Leah frowned. But where is he? That radio barely came through. Mason clicked the radio. Tarek, this is Mason. Where are you? He waited, heart pounding. Static. He clicked again. Tarek, do you copy? Over. A long pause. Then, faintly, rooftops, east, trapped. Mason stood up. He's close. We move now. The rooftop path stretched ahead, a series of narrow jumps, collapsing vents, and rusty ladders. Below, the streets churned with dead, their heads snapping upward whenever the team shifted or whispered. Mason's skin crawled with the feeling of being hunted. They crossed 2 rooftops quickly, leaping gaps and ducking under exposed beams. But as they approached the next ledge, Leah cursed softly. Gaps too wide. Mason peered down. Below, the alley was crawling, dozens of dead pressed shoulder to shoulder, some clawing at the walls, others simply staring upward. He swallowed hard. We can't go down. Sophie's eyes flicked nervously to the side. There's a fire escape, but it's halfway collapsed. Leah studied the metal structure. If we can swing over, we might land on the next building's balcony. Mason gave a grim smile. You're a genius, Leah. They moved carefully, hearts racing. Leah went first, gripping the dangling fire escape and swinging her legs to gain momentum. With a strained grunt, she launched herself toward the next rooftop, landing hard on the balcony. Sophie hesitated. Mason gave her a reassuring nod. You've got this. She nodded, exhaling slowly, then leaped. Mason caught her arm, pulling her up with a grin. See? Easy. His turn. Mason backed up, took a deep breath, and sprinted forward. His boots hit the edge, and the metal gave a sickening groan. He leaped, stretching. His fingers barely caught the ledge. Pain shot through his shoulder as Leah and Sophie scrambled to pull him up. Mason's heart hammered as he rolled onto the balcony. Below, the dead surged, attracted by the noise. "Go, go, go!" Mason urged, pushing the team up the final ladder to the rooftop. They emerged onto the top, and froze. A figure stood near the edge, waving frantically. A thin man, his clothes torn, his face streaked with grime and sweat. "Tarek! Tarek!" Sophie gasped. He turned, eyes wide with relief. "You made it." Mason hurried over, clasping his shoulder. "We heard your broadcast. What's going on?" Tarek's hands trembled as he spoke. "They're learning, Mason. They're not just hunting, they're organizing. I saw them last night. They corralled another group of survivors into the pharmacy, blocked the exits, then," he shuddered. "They waited. It wasn't random. It was a trap." Leah's face hardened. "Who's leading them? Who's giving the orders?" Tarek shook his head. "I don't know. But there's something worse." He pulled a crumpled map from his pocket, spreading it on the rooftop. His finger jabbed at a marked section, a warehouse district, just east of their position. "I watched them bringing crates, supplies. They're gathering things. Weapons, maybe. Tools. They're preparing for something, Mason." Mason's mouth went dry. "They're not just trying to wipe us out. They're preparing for a war," Tarek whispered. Suddenly, Leah's head snapped up. A soft scraping noise came from the far side of the rooftop. Mason rose slowly, hand on his weapon. "We're not alone." From the shadows emerged shapes, not shambling, not stumbling. Smooth, fast, deliberate. The rooftop hunters. "Move!" Mason barked. Gunfire exploded as the team fought their way backward, retreating toward the fire escape. The hunters surged forward, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. Tarek stumbled, Mason yanking him back just in time. Leah fired arrow after arrow, but they kept coming. "This way." Sophie pointed to a narrow maintenance door. They burst through, slamming it shut, shoving a metal pipe through the handle. Inside, the building was pitch black. Only the sound of their ragged breathing filled the air. Mason flicked on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across peeling walls and broken furniture. He exhaled, heart pounding. For now, they were safe. But outside, the dead waited. And the war zone of dead America was just getting deadlier. End of part 3. Want me to roll straight into part 4? Mason leaned against the crumbling wall, his chest heaving. The group huddled inside the dark building, listening to the faint scratching of claws outside the blocked door. Every breath felt like it echoed too loudly, every creak of the floorboards set nerves on edge. "We can't stay here," Leah whispered, pressing her ear to the wall. "They're circling. They'll find another way in." Tarek wiped sweat from his forehead, shaking. "I barely made it out last time." "They don't stop, Mason. They watch. They wait until you're cornered, and then they close in." Mason forced himself to stay calm. "Then we can't let them corner us." He pulled out the map Tarek had shown earlier. "You said they're gathering supplies here?" His finger tapped the warehouse district marked in red. Tarek nodded. "It's a maze of alleys, collapsed buildings, and old truck yards. But the dead, they move through it like they know the layout. Like they've memorized every choke point." Leah crossed her arms. "If we go there, we're walking right into their web." Mason's eyes hardened. "If we don't, we're sitting ducks. We need to know what they're planning." Sophie shifted uneasily. "And what if what they're planning is us?" A sudden crash echoed from above, the rooftop. Heavy thuds followed, shaking dust from the ceiling. "They're on top of us," Mason muttered. "Time's up." Leah pointed to a broken stairwell leading down into the basement. "That's our exit." It connects to the underground service tunnels. If we're lucky, we can slip out the other side without them noticing. Mason nodded. Let's move. The stairwell groaned under their weight as they descended carefully, flashlights casting shaky beams across graffiti-covered walls and broken pipes. Below, the air grew colder, damper. The basement was a sprawling, half-flooded space filled with crates, rotting pallets, and old machinery. Water dripped steadily from cracked pipes overhead. Sophie grimaced as her boots splashed through ankle-deep water. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered. Tarek knelt beside a rusted maintenance door, jiggling the handle. Locked. Mason scanned the room, spotting an old metal rod. With a grunt, he wedged it into the door frame and shoved. The lock snapped with a sharp crack, echoing loudly through the space. Everyone froze. From above came a chorus of shrieks, sharp, angry, alert. "They heard that," Leah hissed. "Go!" Mason barked, pulling the door open. They scrambled through the narrow opening, finding themselves in an old service tunnel lined with flickering, half-dead lights. The air was thick with mildew and rot. Somewhere far ahead, faint sounds echoed, a metallic clatter, distant footsteps, or maybe something worse. Mason held up a hand, signaling them to stop. He crouched, listening. Suddenly, Sophie grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. "Mason, look." Further down the tunnel, barely visible in the dim light, shapes were moving. Not shambling like ordinary dead, patrolling. Pairs of hunters, slipping through the shadows, their movements smooth and precise. "They're guarding the tunnels," Leah whispered. "They knew we'd come this way." Mason clenched his fists. "We pushed through." Quietly. They crept forward, hugging the tunnel walls. Every sound, every drip, every shuffle, set Mason's nerves on fire. As they moved deeper, the air grew colder, and the smell of rot intensified. Suddenly, a soft click under Mason's boot. His blood ran cold. A tripwire. "Down," he roared, shoving the others aside. A metal net shot down from the ceiling, narrowly missing them. But the noise was deafening, a blaring alarm echoed through the tunnels, red warning lights flashing to life. From the shadows, the hunters charged. "Run!" Mason shouted. They bolted down the tunnel, weapons drawn. Leah fired arrows over her shoulder, Sophie swung a metal pipe at anything that got too close. Tarek stumbled but kept moving, Mason dragging him forward. They burst into a larger chamber, an old loading dock, and skidded to a halt. Before them stood dozens of crates, stacked high. And near the center, under a tarp, something large and metallic glinted in the flashing red light. Leah yanked off the tarp, revealing a stockpile of old military gear, armored vests, grenades, high-powered rifles. "This is what they're collecting?" Sophie gasped. "They're hoarding weapons." Mason's mind reeled. "But why? They can't use these." Tarek shook his head. "Unless they're planning to give them to someone who can." Suddenly, a guttural growl sounded from behind. The team whirled, weapons raised. Standing at the tunnel entrance was a new figure, larger, armored, its face hidden behind a cracked military helmet. Not fully dead. Not fully human. A hybrid. It raised a clawed hand, and the hunters surged forward. Mason's heart pounded. The real war had just begun. End of Part 4. Want me to jump straight into Part 5? Mason's breath hitched as he locked eyes with the figure blocking the tunnel. The hybrid stepped forward, its armored boots splashing in the water, helmet gleaming under the flickering red lights. Its growl rumbled like a broken engine, more intelligent, more controlled than the snarling dead they were used to. "Is that?" Sophie whispered, tightening her grip on the pipe. "A hybrid," Tarek breathed, shaking his head in disbelief. "I heard rumors, but I thought they were just stories. Half human, half dead, smarter, faster, deadlier." Mason didn't wait for more details. "Weapons," he barked, yanking a rifle from the nearby crate and tossing it to Leah. He grabbed one for himself and shoved the loaded handgun into Tarek's hands. "We hold them off or we die here." The hybrid let out a shrill, ear-splitting cry. Instantly, the dead hunters behind it surged forward, their movements unervingly coordinated, as if responding to commands. Leah fired the first shot, dropping one of the hunters cleanly. Mason followed, squeezing off rapid rounds, forcing the wave back a step, but the hybrid didn't flinch. With terrifying speed, it lunged. Mason barely dodged the massive swipe, stumbling backward into stacked crates. The hybrid's claws ripped through the wooden walls as if they were paper. "Scatter!" Mason shouted. Leah rolled to cover behind a forklift, firing arrows with deadly precision. Sophie swung her pipe at the encroaching dead, knocking two to the ground. Tarek crouched behind a barrel, hands trembling as he fumbled with the gun's safety. The hybrid turned its head sharply, tracking Mason through the chaos. Mason's heart pounded. He had seen dead. He had seen mutated dead. But this was something else. It wasn't just hunting. It was leading. "Keep it distracted," Mason yelled, ducking as the hybrid swung again. He fired point blank, the bullets pinging uselessly off its reinforced armor. Leah sprinted forward, slashing with a combat knife she'd grabbed from the crates. The hybrid batted her aside with a backhanded blow, sending her crashing into the wall. "Leah!" Sophie screamed, rushing to help. Tarek, shaking violently, managed to fire a shot. It clipped the hybrid's helmet, knocking it slightly askew. For the first time, Mason saw the creature's face. Or what was left of it. Half of its jaw was rotted, the skin stretched unnaturally over sharp teeth. One eye was human, piercing, calculating. The other was clouded, dead. This wasn't a mindless monster. This was a general. "We need to get out of here," Mason shouted, grabbing Leah by the arm. "We're not winning this fight." Sophie swung her pipe at the hybrid again, only to be caught mid-strike. With terrifying strength, the hybrid lifted her off the ground and threw her across the room. Mason's chest clenched. "Sophie!" She groaned weakly, trying to push herself up. Mason's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and boxed in. Unless they found a way out, they were finished. His eyes darted to the old loading dock doors. Rusted, chained, but beyond them, the open streets. "Cover me!" Mason barked, sprinting toward the door. Leah, clutching her bruised ribs, fired another arrow, catching a hunter in the throat. Tarek, pale but determined, kept shooting. Mason slammed into the door, rattling the chains. They were thick, reinforced, no way they'd break by force. He scanned the nearby crates desperately. Explosives. He grabbed a grenade, fingers flying as he yanked the pin. "Everyone down!" He hurled it at the chains and dove aside just as the grenade detonated, blasting the doors open with a deafening roar. Sunlight streamed through the ruined doorway. Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sophie under the arms, pulling her toward the opening. Leah limped beside him, covering their retreat. Tarek stumbled last, firing until his magazine ran dry. The hybrid roared furiously behind them, rallying its hunters. But the team made it through, staggering into the blinding light of day. Outside, the ruined streets stretched out before them, broken cars, collapsed buildings, abandoned barricades. But they were free. For now. Mason didn't stop running until they were several blocks away, ducking into a half-destroyed diner. Only then did they collapse, gasping for breath. Leah clutched her ribs, wincing. "What was that thing, Mason?" Mason shook his head, still reeling. "I don't know. But it's more than just dead. It's organizing them. Commanding them." Tarek stared at the floor. "That's why they've been gathering weapons. They're not just scavenging, they're arming for war." Sophie coughed weakly, leaning against the counter. "How do you fight an enemy like that?" Mason looked out the broken window, eyes narrowing as he saw the dark shapes moving in the distance. "We learn everything we can," he murmured. "Because this isn't just survival anymore. It's war." End of Part 5. Ready for Part 6? Mason crouched by the window of the half-collapsed diner, eyes locked on the distant shapes moving through the street. Dead, but not like the ones they used to know. These were patrols. Organized, scanning alleys, rooftops, and doorways, moving in tight, controlled patterns. Leah sat nearby, pressing a torn cloth to her bruised ribs. Sophie was trying to catch her breath, still shaken from the hybrid's brutal throw. Tarek sat cross-legged on the floor, nervously dismantling and cleaning his gun, his hands shaking ever so slightly. "We can't stay here long," Mason muttered, more to himself than the group. "We need a plan," Leah grunted. "Because right now, we're outnumbered, outgunned, and one bad move away from being swarmed." Mason rubbed his eyes, exhaustion sinking into his bones. "We need allies. Anyone who's still fighting. There's no way we're the only ones left." Tarek looked up sharply. "There's a resistance group, I heard chatter over the old radios before we got cut off. They're holed up at the city armory. Big, fortified, old military stockpiles. If anyone's still holding ground, it's them." Sophie perked up. "Can we get there?" Mason studied the battered city map laid out on the table. "It's across the river. 5 miles, maybe. But the bridges." Leah winced. "Most of them are gone." "Exactly," Mason murmured. "And the dead know that. Which means they've probably fortified the remaining crossings." A low growl echoed outside, making everyone freeze. Mason carefully peeked through the blinds. 2 hunters prowled past, their black eyes sweeping the shadows. But they didn't come closer. "Not yet." "We'll have to go now," Mason said firmly, standing. "Before nightfall. Once it's dark, we won't stand a chance." Sophie groaned softly but forced herself up. "Let's do it." They slipped out the back, sticking to the alleys. The streets were littered with burned-out cars, collapsed storefronts, and half-eaten bodies. Smoke hung in the air, and in the distance, they could hear the constant hum of dead patrols. Every block was a trap waiting to spring. At one narrow intersection, they froze. A patrol was passing right in front of them. Mason quickly signaled for the group to duck behind an overturned van. Leah held her breath as the hybrid-led group moved past. Their armor glinted under the fading sun, their weapons slung with precision. These weren't mindless zombies. These were soldiers. The team waited until the patrol disappeared down another street before slipping out, moving as quietly as they could. But halfway across the block, Sophie stepped on a broken glass bottle. The sharp crack echoed down the alley. Instantly, a nearby dead hunter snapped its head around, snarling. "Run!" Mason barked, pushing Sophie forward. The alley exploded into chaos. Dead poured in from both sides, cutting off escape. Mason fired blindly, covering Sophie and Leah as they scrambled up a nearby fire escape. Tarek spun, firing at the charging horde. "We need height!" Mason shouted. "Rooftops, now!" They scrambled up the rusted ladders, gunshots ringing out. Mason hauled Sophie up first, then Leah, while Tarek covered their backs. But as they reached the top, they were met with another surprise. Across the rooftops, they could see other survivors. Fighters, ragged, armed, desperate, holding positions behind sandbags and barricades. They were picking off dead below, communicating in short, sharp hand signals. One of them spotted Mason's group and waved them over urgently. Mason didn't hesitate. "Go!" They sprinted across the rooftops, jumping gaps, dodging collapsing bricks, bullets zipping past as dead archers fired from below. Mason's lungs burned, but he didn't stop until they reached the fortified rooftop where the survivors waited. A tall woman with a scarred face pulled Mason up by the arm. "Who are you?" she demanded, rifle slung over her shoulder. "Mason. We're trying to reach the armory." "You're insane," the woman muttered, shaking her head. "The dead control every bridge. And now they've got hybrids guarding the crossings." Mason gritted his teeth. "We know. But we have to try." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We've been holding this sector for 2 days. But we're running low on everything: food, ammo, bodies. We were planning to fall back to the armory ourselves. Leah limped forward, face pale but determined. Then let's do it together. The woman gave a grim smile. Name's Captain Reyes. Welcome to the Warzone. As night began to fall, the rooftops lit up with scattered fires, and the dead below regrouped. Mason stood at the edge, watching the shadows gather, hybrids barking out sharp commands. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were preparing for the next phase. And Mason knew one thing for sure: if they didn't reach the armory, if they didn't warn the resistance, Dead America's Warzone would soon become a graveyard for every living soul left. End of Part 6. Ready for Part 7. The night air was thick with smoke and the distant howls of the dead. Mason crouched beside Captain Reyes on the rooftop, peering through battered binoculars at the bridges ahead. There, Reyes whispered, pointing. That's the old Eastman Bridge. Steel, reinforced, but look. Mason followed her finger. His stomach tightened. Dead patrols clustered at both ends, hybrids stalking the perimeter, their black armor glinting faintly under flickering streetlights. Even worse, large hunks of the bridge's middle section were missing, likely blown away by desperate survivors trying to cut off access days ago. That's suicide, Leah muttered behind them. We'll never make it across. We don't have a choice, Mason said grimly. The west bridge is already gone. The tunnels are flooded. That leaves Eastman. Tarek adjusted his rifle, checking his last few rounds. And if we don't cross tonight, they'll reinforce even more by morning. Reyes gave a sharp nod. We've got a window. Small, but real. My team can lay down suppressing fire, but you'll have to move fast. Sophie tightened the straps on her pack, swallowing her fear. Let's go, then. Reyes gathered her ragtag squad, about 6 survivors, some barely older than teenagers, armed with mismatched weapons and sheer stubbornness. They lined up along the edge, setting up positions behind sandbags and old barrels. When we open fire, Reyes explained, you run. Don't look back. Mason gripped her forearm. Thank you. She gave him a fierce smile. Make it count. The moment the first shot cracked through the night, chaos erupted. Mason led his group down the fire escape, sprinting through the shadows toward the bridge. Gunfire lit up the darkness, drawing the dead's attention. Hybrids snarled, barking sharp commands as they scrambled to respond. Mason's boots pounded the cracked pavement. Leah ran beside him, face pale but determined. Tarek covered their rear, while Sophie sprinted ahead, nimble and fast despite her small frame. They reached the bridge's edge, and Mason's heart sank. Gaps. Huge, gaping holes where the concrete had collapsed, leaving twisted metal beams exposed. There. Leah pointed to a narrow path along the side, where steel beams and scaffolding jutted out just enough to crawl across. Without thinking, Mason dropped to his hands and knees, shimmying across the narrow edge. Wind howled around him, the dark river far below. One wrong move, and he'd plummet into the freezing, debris-choked water. Sophie followed close behind, her breath coming in shaky gasps. Tarek moved last, his gun slung over his shoulder, hands gripping the beams tightly. Behind them, the firefight on the rooftop raged. Mason dared a glance back. Reyes and her team were holding, but only just. Hybrids were closing in, and the dead were flooding the streets below, drawn by the noise. Hurry! Leah hissed. Mason pushed forward, muscles burning, until they reached the other side. They tumbled onto the cracked pavement, hearts pounding, chests heaving. But they weren't safe yet. The dead on the far end had already regrouped, hybrids leading a flanking maneuver. We have to move. Mason barked. They sprinted through the maze of wrecked vehicles and burning barricades. Mason fired as he ran, clipping a dead soldier in the shoulder. Leah hurled a makeshift Molotov, the flames lighting up the night as a group of hybrids scattered. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air, and Tarek collapsed. Sophie screamed, diving to his side. Mason spun, eyes wide. A hybrid sniper, perched on the remains of a billboard, was already reloading. Mason didn't think, he aimed and fired, 1, 2, 3 shots. The hybrid jerked, then tumbled backward, disappearing behind the billboard's frame. Tarek groaned, clutching his leg. Blood seeped between his fingers. "I'm fine," he gasped. "Keep going." Mason and Leah hauled him up, draping his arms over their shoulders. Sophie led the way, weaving through alleyways, dodging patrols, and slipping through narrow gaps between buildings. The armory loomed ahead, a squat, reinforced structure surrounded by sandbag walls and watchtowers. Mason's heart leapt. But then the floodlights snapped on. Voices barked over megaphones. Figures emerged, weapons raised. Mason raised his arms. "We're survivors," he shouted hoarsely. "We're not infected." A tense moment, then the gates creaked open. Armed fighters rushed out, pulling them inside, slamming the heavy doors behind them. Mason sagged with relief as Tarek was taken to a medic. Leah dropped to her knees, gasping for air. Sophie clung to Mason's arm, trembling but alive. An older man in battered body armor approached, flanked by guards. "Name's Commander Holt," he said sharply. "You brought company." Mason's heart sank as he realized what Holt meant. Outside, the dead weren't retreating. They were gathering. Surrounding the armory. Preparing for the final siege. End of Part 7. Let me know when to drop Part 8. The walls of the armory vibrated under the force of the dead gathering outside. Mason stood at one of the narrow slits cut into the reinforced wall, peering out as shapes shifted and clustered in the dark. The hybrids were out there, he could feel it. Not just mindless undead, but intelligent, tactical predators. Inside, the survivors rushed to prepare. Commander Holt barked orders, his voice sharp and controlled despite the chaos. "Barricade the west entrance. Get the heavy guns mounted. We hold this position, no matter what." Leah crouched beside Mason, loading fresh rounds into a battered rifle. "I thought we'd made it," she muttered, her voice shaking slightly. "I really thought this was the safe zone." Mason placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's not over yet. But we'll hold." Sophie appeared, carrying a crate of ammunition, her face pale but determined. She shot Mason a look. She was young, but her eyes had hardened over the past days, the kind of transformation only warzones bring. Across the room, Tarek limped toward them, his leg wrapped tightly, a crutch tucked under his arm. "They patched me up as best they could. I'm still in this." Mason gave him a tired grin. "Good. We're going to need everyone." Suddenly, the alarm bell rang out, a harsh, grating clang that sent everyone sprinting to their positions. "They're coming." The first wave hit like a tidal surge. Dead soldiers hurled themselves against the barricades, snarling and clawing. Hybrids stayed back, directing the attack, signaling with hand gestures and guttural sounds. Machine guns roared from the tower, sweeping the horde with fire. Mason took position at one of the firing slits, squeezing off shots, forcing himself to aim carefully, not waste a single bullet. Leah crouched beside him, alternating between firing and tossing homemade explosives, small, but powerful enough to scatter clusters of dead. Sophie and Tarek worked the interior defenses, handing off fresh ammunition, shoving crates into place, reinforcing weakened spots in the barricades. Outside, the hybrids adjusted tactics. Instead of throwing more bodies at the front, they began circling to the sides, probing the defenses for weaknesses. Mason saw them moving and shouted, "They're flanking." Commander Holt bellowed for reinforcements, but they were stretched thin. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the west wall. Dust and smoke filled the air as part of the outer barricade crumbled. Dead poured in through the breach. Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed Leah's arm. "With me!" They charged toward the breach, firing as they ran. Sophie trailed behind, wide-eyed but brave, clutching a loaded shotgun. Tarek limped after them, teeth clenched in pain, refusing to be left behind. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, hand-to-hand at times. Mason slammed a hybrid back with the butt of his rifle, ducked under a swing, then fired point-blank into its chest. Leah tossed a makeshift grenade, the blast sending Dead tumbling. Sophie's shotgun roared, knocking attackers back with each blast. Tarek covered the side, his shots precise despite his injury. For a brief moment, they pushed the Dead back, just enough for the barricade crew to haul fresh debris into place, blocking the breach. Breathless, Mason leaned against the wall, sweat pouring down his face. "How long do you think we can hold?" he asked quietly. Commander Holt appeared, grim-faced. "Depends. They're testing us right now. But they haven't even unleashed their real strength." Mason's heart sank. As if summoned by his fear, a new figure emerged from the shadows outside. A massive hybrid, larger and more heavily armored than the rest. Its glowing eyes scanned the defenses with chilling intelligence. It let out a guttural roar, and the entire horde surged forward in response. "Get the heavy guns!" Holt roared. "Take it down!" Machine guns opened fire, tracer rounds lighting up the night. But the creature was fast, dodging and weaving, using Dead soldiers as living shields. It smashed into the barricades with terrifying strength, punching through reinforced steel as if it were paper. Mason felt a cold weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just a siege. This was an execution. He turned to Leah, Sophie, and Tarek. "We need a plan. Fast." Leah's eyes darted to the old service tunnel beneath the armory. "The tunnel. It leads to the riverbank. We can slip out, regroup, and come back with reinforcements." Holt overheard and shook his head. "If you leave, you're on your own. We're holding here." Mason hesitated, torn between loyalty to these defenders and the grim reality that staying meant death. A fresh explosion shook the walls. The giant hybrid smashed through the final barricade, leading a flood of Dead into the armory. Sophie grabbed Mason's arm. "We have to go. Now." Mason locked eyes with Holt, who gave him a small, grim nod. "Go." Without another word, Mason, Leah, Tarek, and Sophie sprinted toward the service tunnel, slipping through just as the final defenses collapsed behind them. As they ran, Mason knew one thing for sure. This Warzone was far from over. End of Part 8. Ready for Part 9? Let me know, and I'll keep the suspense tight. The narrow service tunnel echoed with hurried footsteps, labored breathing, and the occasional clatter of gear. Mason led the way, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as it swept the dank walls. Behind him, Leah kept a tight grip on Sophie's hand, guiding her over broken pipes and debris. Tarek limped along, his crutch thudding softly with every step, his face pale but determined. They emerged into the cold night air by the riverbank, the moon casting long shadows over the dark water. Behind them, faint booms rumbled from the armory, the sounds of the battle continuing without them. Mason clenched his fists, guilt gnawing at him. "We left them," he murmured. "We had no choice," Leah said quickly, though her voice trembled. "We'd be dead if we stayed." Sophie turned, watching the faint glow in the distance where the armory stood. "Do you think anyone made it out?" Mason took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. "Maybe. But right now, we need to regroup and figure out what's next." Tarek lowered himself onto a rock, exhaling sharply. "We're down to, what? 4 people? And the hybrids know we escaped." That thought sent a chill through them all. Suddenly, a rustling noise came from the tree line. Mason raised his rifle instantly, eyes sharp. Leah followed, pulling Sophie gently behind her, while Tarek struggled to lift his weapon. A figure emerged, hands raised. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" It was a woman, mid-30s, wearing scavenged tactical gear, a backpack slung over one shoulder. She approached cautiously, eyes darting between them. "Name's Elena," she said softly. "I saw you slip out. Figured you could use some help." Mason kept his rifle trained on her. "You're alone?" "Not exactly," Elena replied, glancing over her shoulder. Another figure appeared, a man, older, with graying hair and a makeshift bandolier of shotgun shells. "This is Grant," Elena added. "We've been tracking the Dead's movements along the river. We know a place they can't reach." Mason exchanged glances with Leah, Tarek, and Sophie. Relief flickered, but only briefly. "How do we know you're not working with them?" Leah asked warily. Elena gave a bitter laugh. "Trust me, if we were working with them, you'd already be dead." Mason sighed. "Fine. Lead the way. But we stay sharp." They moved quickly, following Elena and Grant along a narrow path that hugged the riverbank. The night was filled with strange sounds, the occasional distant screech, splashes in the water, the soft crack of branches breaking underfoot. Sophie tugged at Mason's sleeve. "Why can't the Dead cross the river?" "They can," Elena answered from ahead. "But they don't like to. There's something about the deep water. Maybe instinct, maybe memory. Doesn't matter. We just use it to buy time." As they walked, Mason noticed signs of old fights, spent shell casings, splintered trees, charred patches of ground. This path had been contested before. After nearly an hour, they reached an old boathouse tucked beneath a rocky overhang. Elena slipped inside first, sweeping the space with her light. "Clear," she called softly. Inside, the boathouse was cramped but intact. A few supplies were stacked against the wall, water, some food, medical kits. Grant settled by the door, keeping watch. Elena passed out water bottles, her hands quick and practiced. Mason sat down heavily, leaning back against the cold wall. Leah sat beside him, head resting briefly on his shoulder. Sophie curled up nearby, eyes heavy with exhaustion but still alert. Tarek unwrapped his leg, wincing as he checked the wound. "We can't stay here long," Elena said quietly, crouching beside them. "This is just a stopover. Our real safe zone is deeper inland. Fortified. Survivors, supplies, even radio equipment." Mason frowned. "You're telling me there's still a real base out there?" Elena nodded. "We've been trying to rebuild, bit by bit. But we're under constant threat. Especially from those hybrids." She lowered her voice. "They're getting smarter. Coordinating. Something's changing." Mason felt a knot tighten in his chest. "We need to get to that base," he said firmly. "We can't keep running forever." Elena smiled faintly. "That's the plan." Suddenly, Grant stiffened by the door. Movement. Everyone froze. Mason gripped his rifle, heart pounding. Leah moved quietly to Sophie, shielding her. Tarek forced himself upright, weapon ready. Elena crept to the window, peering through a narrow gap. Shapes moved outside, fast, deliberate. Not the shuffling of typical Dead. These were hybrids. Mason's blood ran cold. How did they track us so fast? Elena's face darkened. "They always know." A sharp pounding hit the boathouse door. Mason's breath caught. There was no way they could hold this place, it was too small, too flimsy. Elena's eyes flicked to Mason. "There's a tunnel beneath the floorboards. Emergency escape. We can use it, but we have to go now." Without wasting another second, Mason, Leah, Sophie, and Tarek scrambled to help lift the old boards. A dark, narrow hole yawned beneath. The pounding on the door grew louder. Grant shoved a cabinet in front of the entrance, buying them precious seconds. As Mason prepared to drop into the tunnel, he felt Leah squeeze his arm. "We're not done yet," she whispered. He nodded grimly. "Not even close." End of Part 9. Want me to continue to Part 10, the finale? Let me know. The tunnel beneath the boathouse was cold, narrow, and smelled of damp earth. Mason led the way, crawling on his elbows, feeling the weight of the world pressing down. Behind him, Leah helped Sophie along, whispering soft encouragement. Tarek dragged himself through despite the pain in his leg, gritting his teeth. Elena brought up the rear, her flashlight flicking nervously over the walls. Above them, they could hear the muffled sounds of the hybrids breaking into the boathouse. Grant's shotgun boomed once, twice, then fell silent. Mason clenched his fists, grief punching the air out of his lungs. "He bought us time," Elena whispered. "Let's not waste it." The tunnel opened onto a rocky slope near the river. They emerged under the stars, the cold wind biting at their faces. Mason pulled himself up and scanned the dark tree-line ahead. "We keep moving," he said firmly. "No stopping." They moved quickly, crossing the river using a half-submerged bridge, careful to avoid the gaps and weak planks. On the other side, Elena led them up a narrow path into the hills. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional crack of branches or the distant, inhuman screeches echoing from the valley below. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, they reached a fortified outpost hidden among the trees. Makeshift walls built from scrap metal and wood surrounded a cluster of small buildings. Armed survivors stood guard, eyes wary but hopeful as Elena waved them over. "You made it," one of the guards said, ushering them inside. Elena introduced Mason and his group quickly, and soon they were ushered into a main building where a handful of leaders gathered. "We've been tracking the hybrids," Elena explained to the leaders. "They're moving faster, coordinating attacks. They're adapting." Mason spoke up. "We need to hit them before they hit us. If we wait, they'll overrun this place just like they did the armory." The camp's leader, a tall woman named Captain Reyes, nodded grimly. "We've been preparing for a final stand. You just arrived in time." Mason felt a surge of resolve. This was it, the last chance to push back before the dead swallowed everything. The survivors worked through the day, fortifying the defenses, setting traps, and readying weapons. Mason joined the fighters, while Leah helped with medical prep, and Sophie assisted wherever she could, carrying supplies. Tarek, despite his injured leg, worked with the engineers, offering clever rigging ideas for explosives and barricades. By nightfall, the forest was alive with tension. Everyone was in position, nerves stretched tight. Mason stood beside Leah at the front line, gripping his rifle. He glanced down at Sophie, who stood determinedly between them, holding a small knife. "You stay behind the wall," Mason told her softly. "No matter what." Sophie nodded, her eyes fierce. Elena approached, crouching beside them. "They're coming." The woods fell silent for a moment. Then, a roar split the air. The first wave surged from the trees, dead and hybrids, charging with terrifying speed. Gunfire erupted along the barricade. Mason squeezed the trigger, dropping the first creature in his sights. Beside him, Leah fired steadily, her face set with fierce determination. Explosions lit the night as Tarek's traps went off, blasting through clusters of attackers. But still they came. The hybrids darted through the chaos, using their twisted intelligence to slip past defenses. Mason spotted one scaling the side wall and shouted, spinning to blast it off the barricade just in time. Sophie ducked low, her small hands trembling as she clutched her knife. Hours seemed to blur. The defenders fell back step by step, the battle raging through the camp center. Inside the command post, Captain Reyes called out final orders, her voice hoarse. "If we fall here, there's nowhere else to go." Mason felt the weight of those words. This wasn't just a battle, it was survival itself. As dawn's first light crept over the hills, the attackers hesitated, snarling and screeching in frustration. The dead didn't like sunlight, but the hybrids were different, they paused only briefly, regrouping. "We have to end this now," Mason realized. Elena ran up, breathless. "The fuel tanks. We can ignite them, take out the remaining hybrids." Captain Reyes nodded sharply. "Do it." Mason and Leah sprinted to the tanks, lighting fuses while Tarek and the engineers prepped charges. As the hybrids stormed the camp's heart, the explosions ripped through the air, fireballs roaring into the sky, engulfing the enemy in flames. The shockwave knocked Mason off his feet. When the smoke cleared, the camp was in ruins, but the attackers were gone. Mason pulled himself up, coughing, his ears ringing. Leah staggered to his side, Sophie clinging to her. Tarek limped over, supported by Elena. Captain Reyes surveyed the destruction, a weary but triumphant look on her face. We held. Mason looked around at the survivors, at the battered walls and smoldering ground. It wasn't a victory, not really. But it was survival. And sometimes, that was enough. He took Leah's hand, pulling Sophie into a hug, and looked out over the hills beyond. Dead America's Warzone had claimed so much, but as long as they kept fighting, they weren't finished yet. Not by a long shot. End of Part 10, Finale. If you want, I can write a sequel outline or spin-off from this, just tell me.